So in addition to being the height of the UK's coronavirus lockdown, March through July 2020 was also a period where a lot of the students I support typically engage in BA or MA dissertation research with primary sources. So just as a little bit of an introduction, what I mean by primary sources, I'm largely thinking of this in the context that historians typically use the word primary sources. So a document, a text, an image, a piece of artwork, and so on, that was created by someone who's kind of living at the same time as the events they describe, or somehow has a first-hand perspective on those. And then by an archive, what I mean is a deliberate collection of those sources. And typically when we kind of think of archives, we think of, sort of old stuff, maybe associated with famous people, that kind of thing. But that's not necessarily the case with archives. Archives can really be any collection of material that's sort of preserved because it is or might be of interest. So for example, the University of Cambridge Library is currently kind of collecting material related to the coronavirus to kind of have that archive for future areas. Okay, yeah.
Hopefully that's sharing properly.
Yeah, I can see it. I hope everyone else can too. How do I? Sorry for being.
If you just say next slide, I'll progress for you.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So if you could go on to my next slide, please. So in this conversation, I'm going to talk about kind of three specific things. So I'm going to talk about the archives workshop and research support that I've kind of run in the past. I'm going to talk about student expectations of finding information online. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the things that librarians tend to call search strategies, but some of the ways in which I try and assist students and help them in kind of maximizing their ability to successfully find what they want to find. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things I noticed as a librarian, especially during lockdown, is how very strongly people tend to associate libraries and archives with physical spaces. So things like one of the first group meetings I attended in lockdown with academics, I was sort of set to deliver a library update as part of that meeting. And, kind of got a bit cut off by someone saying, "Is there any library update? The library is closed," which was a nice example of how much, when the doors are shut, people think that the collection is really closed. And some of the headlines, the ways libraries have featured in headlines or even in kind of guidance about access, kind of really tend to emphasize that sort of physical space of things. So if I could go on to the next slide. So since 2018, I have run a twice yearly workshop for research students, so primarily MA and PhD students, on archives, which has led to the opportunity to run focused and discipline-specific workshops within particular programs regarding, for example, the use of archives in drama and theater research and so on. So there's a dual kind of focus of the workshops that I've run. So first of all, helping students to use discovery tools to find archives that are of interest for their research. And second of all, helping them to prepare for an initial visit to a physical archive, and also just kind of making them aware of archival resources that are available to them locally. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So typically the discovery tools I work with students are both online. They're called Archives Hub, which is kind of a big collection of UK and Irish archives, and the National UK, and both of contain overviews of archives and some of the collections they contain. So they're a good way for students to kind of start exploring. So next slide, please. So supporting undergraduate researchers is typically a bit different. Our consultations are usually one-to-one, and the students' research and support needs tend to vary. Often one of the things I find is that undergraduate researchers have a much clearer and more focused idea of what their dissertation topic is. This is in part because by the time they're usually seeking library support, they've been through a second-year dissertation preparation module. They've done quite a bit of work around their topic, but they're often looking for a very specific archive. And that leads to some interesting things about their expectations. On to the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things I notice, and we can go on to the next slide, is that students tend to very much have an expectation that, they'll kind of follow the yellow brick road. They have a very clear idea of what they want, and they have a very fixed idea of what will be useful to them. Which in some ways makes the searching easier, and other ways makes the searching potentially harder. So if we could go on to the next slide. One of the things for sort of typical age and typical entry university students that sometimes gets thrown around is the idea that they're digital natives. They've grown up in an information rich and internet savvy environments. Obviously, there are all kinds of sort of ways to unpick that as being not true for everyone. And broadly speaking, even if they've had sort of different digital experiences, many students will have kind of two expectations. They'll expect a fast and seamless search experience, and they'll expect that the open web will have everything that they need for research. And there'll also be a kind of underlying assumption of, well, why isn't everything digitized? So not really kind of understanding some of the issues of kind of time, technology, and expense that actually go into making an archival source freely available online. So one of the things we can think about there is breaking down how a student searches for a digital archive to help them locate what they need effectively. And this is where I kind of try and go through a kind of step-by-step process with students to kind of think about what they'd like to find. So the first step on the next slide is thinking about what their research question actually is, and then breaking that down into keywords. One of the adjustments that sometimes has to be made in students' research process is adapting to the fact that many databases and online archives index information by keyword. So a sentence or sentence fragment isn't necessarily going to give them the best kind of information. And even with a Google search or kind of another open web search, thinking of an archive in terms of kind of who, what, when, and where usually helps them bring back better results. The next thing on the next slide to talk about is alternative keywords. Archives are cataloged by humans, and those catalogs reflect societal conventions and prejudices at the time that they were made. So getting students to think about how someone with a different mindset might describe the information they're looking for can often be quite helpful. The next thing on the next slide to think about is how to actually limit that search. Everything is not a helpful amount of information to try and wade through. And so restricting the search somehow, perhaps to archives associated with a specific person, a specific time period, or a specific place or country are all tactics that can be used to make the search manageable. And this is also where it becomes helpful to recommend specialist libraries. So things like the Women's Library at LSE or Glasgow, the Library of Congress, for students who are working on American history, sometimes the libraries of individual presidents, which often have quite good digital collections, and specific things such as the immensely helpful research guides from the National Archives for researching things like LGBTQ history, for example. Also, I try and encourage kind of through the process of this conversation, getting a better idea of what the student themselves is kind of thinking of different areas of their research topic. This tends to help with finding ways to recommend specific library databases, kind of creating a match between the student's topic and a potential source, and kind of giving them some advice and suggestions on how to explore these. So the penultimate step on the next slide we kind of go through in some of these consultations is looking over what the student has found, and in particular, not kind of discarding something away right away because it isn't exactly right. For example, thinking that if the student is looking for diaries and their search has brought up a collection of letters from the time period or the person they're associated with, kind of maybe sort of thinking about exploring those a little bit rather than kind of continuing to focus on diaries. So trying to foster a bit of a process of adaptability. And finally, on the next slide, just encouraging them to try again and be comfortable with trying again and thinking about the fact that the magic doesn't usually happen on the first go. So lastly, on the next slide, one of the things I teach in my archives workshop is that students should expect the unexpected. As part of their research process, they might find themselves looking under stones that they never intended to overturn. And finally, on the last slide, giving them a kind of a picture of and enthusiasm for online archives, which are available at a time that suits them as a researcher. The doors might be closed, but the archive is open. On my final slide, thank you for listening.